So yeah, thank you all for joining us once again. Um, my name is Jay Bell. I'm a pre-press specialist and account manager for Panda Game Manufacturing. And thank you for sharing all of the game ideas and mechanics and components that you're really interested in utilizing in your upcoming design. So today we're going to talk about how you can best design your game so that manufacturing is smooth and your game is not a game, it's a product that's feasible and functional. So to give you a little bit of history about Panda, we have been manufacturing games for over 15 years now, 16 years even. The company was started in Vancouver, and we do our manufacturing in Shenzhen, China. We have team members that work all across the globe. As you can see, I am in sort of a home office space. This is actually the Gumbo Pod where I do some board game streaming sometime. And we have team members in Portugal and York, Europe, Canada, all across the US. Clark, as he says, he's a Chicago Panda. So yeah, we have team members in your time zone, and we want to, make sure you have someone that can speak your language and communicate with you at a time and in a way that's convenient for you. So we work with publishers of many different sizes. We work with indie folks. We did a project for the Cranky Chinchillas folks, which is a very large card game that hit crowdfunding last year. We work with Devious Weasel Games, famous for Cosmic Frog and more titles. We also work with really big clients like Ivy Studios, Stonemaier, Keymaster, and many, many more. So let's talk about our team a bit. I mentioned that we're all across the globe, but what makes us qualified to talk about game design with manufacturing in mind, right? It's because we have a team of designers. We're not just board game players or people who are great with manufacturing knowledge. We have board game design knowledge as well. So if you take a look at this picture, 6 of the people in this photo are, I would say, vocal about their game designs. We have many team members who kind of have like little notebooks that they haven't quite shared their ideas from yet, but we are very design savvy, and we're excited and interested about making games and how to do that well. So let's talk about the risk of not designing with manufacturing in mind. Games are very much so like our babies, right? It's tough to kind of break that mindset, but sometimes what you think might be perfect for your baby or your game might not be what helps it thrive. And it's risky because of time. When you design with manufacturing in mind, you can help save time in a very already long and iterative process where game design requires, thinking about what does this component do for the game? What does this phase of the game do for the game or this mechanic? So it can also work as a really strong selling point for crowdfunding or pitching when you know your game is feasible and you can keep the MSRP down, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So talking about the solution to that risk, that problem, depending on what your goals are for your game. I know, not everyone is designing board games in order to turn them into a product and sell them, but let's assume for this presentation that you are, and that in some capacity you want your game to be available for people outside of your friend group and your family and yourself. So in this case, your game would be considered a product, and a product needs to be attractive to its audience, but it also needs to be feasible. So consider how the intended experience of your game and the price point align with the components, right? So intended experience, price point, and making your components align with that. The intention is that in the end, your product is streamlined and all of your components have intention and make a more cost-effective product. So in summary, today we're going to talk about board game economics, and yes, that's math, but we won't spend too much time there, I promise. We're going to talk about games and products and UX and UI design. We're going to talk about optimization, and we're going to talk about final tweaks. Also, shout out to Matthew on the chat, just being a superstar, supporting with screenshots of everything for those who aren't getting video. I really appreciate that. So, board game economics, right? The first thing you need to know is there's a price associated, right? If you look at this breakdown, you have the MSRP, which is shown at $50. You have retailers pay, typically for this case, $25. Distributors paying at about $20, and publishers paying at about $10 for their landing costs. So let's break this down. There's two ways to go about it. You can either set your MSRP based on the experience that you intend to provide through the game. So thinking like, oh, I have, a 54 card game. Is that going to be an experience that people want to pay about $15 or $20 for? Or is this card game something that's truly, truly special and worth a $30 MSRP, right? You can think about how to price your game based on the intended experience. Or you can use the manufacturing costs or the landing costs to base your MSRP. And we're going to do the latter because that's a little more common, right? So let's look at that publisher paid cost at $10. Let's say the unit cost of your game is $7, and you can factor in about $3 for shipping. And I'll talk about how that shipping cost can kind of be thought about. But there's many things to factor into the price when you sell to distributors. Remember, this is per unit, but when you sell to retailers like your FLGS, and then they sell up to the client or the consumer, it'll end up being, twice that price at $50. So let's just kind of go through this, right? The MSRP, we have the landing cost for manufacturing plus shipping. And here, you see that distributor costs, or the charge that you'll give to distributors, includes a lot of things. So this is based on the manufacturing and shipping being the landing cost at $10, and then the publisher factoring in art, royalties, operation costs, marketing, taxes, profit, anything that the publisher has to think about when producing that product, and when that product is, like all the money that has to be accounted for when that product is made, who has to be paid, who has to, what marketing has to be done, what taxes have to be done. All that factors in what you pay or what you charge the distributor. So $10 for landing costs, $10 for all of the extra things that don't really get talked about much or considered much. That'll help you determine your distributor price. And so from there, the distributor would give it to a retailer at a profit of about $25, and then the retailer would sell it to a consumer for a profit, usually at about $50. So if you look at that MSRP of $50, you'll notice that it's 5 times higher than the publisher landing cost. And that's typically what game designers and publishers try to do, is get a 5 times, up to 8 or even 10 times sometimes MSRP. So when you're thinking about how much does my game cost as a landing cost, and then what's that 5 or 8 or 6 or 10 times multiplier, that'll help you determine the MSRP. And then you can also work backwards. If you know your experience is a game, or your game is this experience of, $100, then you can do a 5 times divider and say, okay, my unit cost needs to be no more than 20, but that's estimating a little high, maybe for a bigger game. So how does MSRP affect the design? MSRP can, like I mentioned before, determine the experience. So if you have an MSRP of $50, what does that mean for the shelf space, right? If you think about a game like Catan, and you see it on a shelf, you know what size that box is. You know when people pick up that box, they're going to think, okay, does this feel like $50, like it's worth $50. They'll do the same with Seven Wonders or Root or Exploding Kittens at $20. And so, yeah, there's a psychology that plays into how much the MSRP affects what's inside of your box or what can be inside of your box feasibly. So once you have that box size, you'll use that to determine, okay, what's the biggest component that I can fit into it? It's usually my game board, and from there, your game board will determine the size of maybe the cards that go on it or the tokens that go on it. And there's sort of that math engine that helps you figure out, just from an MSRP, what size my components need to be. This is the only way to go about it, but it's a very, very efficient way to go about it. All right, so now let's talk about games, UX, and UI, and products. I recently talked about this on the Meeple Sherp show, but we'll go into a little more depth here. So, talking about components, right? If you look at this chart, it goes from left to right, with least expensive to most expensive for two types of components, basic ones and custom ones. So you have, on the very, very left, you almost can miss it if you aren't looking far enough. You have Punchboard. Punchboard is extremely versatile. It can be used to make basic components like, score, victory point markers. It can be damage chits. It can even be player tokens. And then you have wooden and plastic cubes. They're about interchangeable as far as costs. Then you have some custom wood pieces, and these are basic custom shapes like houses or meeple shapes, right? And then next you have resin, which are 3D, very stable and sturdy structures, so not very elaborate features. And then you have metal components at the top in that basic tier. And then looking below that, we have the more custom pieces. Again, Punchboard can be very custom. Thinking about the dice tower in Wingspan, right? Or any cardboard constructibles, really. It can be used in a very versatile way for a really efficient price. Next, you can think about meeples that have very interesting undercuts. These are laser cut, which is a little more expensive than the loaf cut of a common shaped meeple that doesn't have those sort of undercuts, in, like maybe an underarm, or as you can see in the horse, there's like a flag that would require some very, very intricate cutting. Next up, you have plastics, right? We all love miniatures. Plastics are a great way to represent custom pieces on a board, and the price kind of goes in line with that, right? And it's all based on that intended experience that you want for the consumer. And you have more custom resin pieces. Keep in mind with resin that this material can only withstand so much strain, right? So these pieces are better off being very, not compact, but not having really crazy, intricate designs like the horse that you see as a laser cut wood piece. And then lastly, you have custom metals, which you can use for tokens like Parks does with their enamel, first player token. You can do some really nice things with metal, such as coins and all those other things. So, if you've heard the phrase, less is more, then this slide might resonate with you. So, fewer components, fewer costs, right? Or quicker setup, easier to teach, easier to get to the table. More people want to play it, more people want to talk about it, more people want to buy it, and then in the end, realize that the more fiddly your game is, the higher the cost, right? Again, this all depends on your game's intended experience. But the fewer components you can distill your game down to the more cost effective and cascading through all of these, the more accessible your game might be, right? And that's not enough to our very large, very in-depth, Twilight Imperium style games. It's just something to keep in mind. That game offers a very grandiose experience, and it probably comes with a lot of boxes to check and be very sure of when you're thinking about that design. So again, more fiddliness, higher cost. And with the term fiddliness, that I probably can't say 5 times fast, we'll go a little more in depth with it. So UX and UI is very important for game design. And just to kind of talk about the difference between the two, components kind of serve as your UI of your game, right? User interface, how a person is interacting with your game, how they're going into that intended experience that you're creating. UX is what happens and what do players feel from interacting with the UI, right? Those two things should drive your decisions when deciding on components. What are the best UI choices for the UX? That makes sense. Okay, so things that can help you answer these questions. I'm going to go into some examples here. I think it's on the next slide. So actually, I'll go back a little bit. So things that can help you with this, answer these questions are the usability, the accessibility, the engagement, the reduced cognitive load, language, and then iconography. All of those things are things that can help you figure out what components make the most sense for your user experience. So how are players interacting with resource tokens? Can they be traded? Do players not trade them? How many resources can be accumulated? Should the resources be visible? All of those things make a difference for the components that you could choose, right? If you're playing Seven Wonders and you needed to pay a player 2 coins to use a resource that they produce, it's better to actually have coins instead of a dial that tracks how many coins you currently have, because then you have to dial down yours and tell that player, hey, make sure you dial up yours, instead of the actual act, the physical tactile act of giving them those 2 coins, right? But on the flip side, for health and unmatched, tokens could work, but a dial is a much more elegant and probably more cost-efficient solution, right? Let's talk about setup time for boards and randomizers and storage of these things. Boards are great for modularity, but if you think about the extra costs, extra weight, the time that it takes for you to decide, okay, are we playing the summer board, or are we playing the frigid Ice Mountain board? Can this just be one double-sided board? Can we use one board and have some sort of overlay or pieces that change what that season or scenario is? Let's also talk about campaigns and moving to new areas, right? We could have many different boards for that, or you could just use a spiral-bound book like Sleeping Gods does to indicate where you are in an area, right? Another thing to keep in mind is the sort of choice of a component. Let's say you have 4 resources in your game, and it's an apple, a wheat, iron, and water. You could do a red cube, a yellow cube, a gray cube, and a blue cube, and that's probably what players are going to call them in the game. Or you could have a red apple shape and a yellow stick even, and a gray trapezoid, a raindrop, or even a circle for the water. These sorts of decisions help players reduce that cognitive load, knowing that, okay, the blue cube, it looks like water, but is it iron? Not so sure. If they're shaped differently, then that can also help make that determination really easily through the user interface. And then we can talk about meeples versus minis. And I don't want to blow up the chat with a controversial discussion, but things to think about with this. What is that intended experience, and how much are people going to want to pay for my game? I can't imagine Carcassonne with miniatures instead of meeples. I mean, I could if I really wanted to, but I can't imagine how much that would change the cost, the experience. But I also couldn't imagine, or I wouldn't want to imagine Blood Rage with meeples, although I am a proponent of custom meeples to a very high extent. Anyway, these are the questions that you should ask yourself, like, what's the right experience for my players, and is that feasible for the cost? Does information need to accompany these miniatures or meeples, right? If there's health involved, a dial or something attached to that miniature, which is possible, would be helpful. But if there's ownership involved, you could also use, why am I blanking on? Base snaps. Yes, base snaps for your miniatures, whereas meeples have a little more trouble to assign ownership to in that way, if they're communal. It's possible, but these are things to consider, right? And then wood versus plastic. These two can often be very similar in cost, so you really have a choice of what fits the theme. If you have a space game, then plastic might make a little more sense than wood for the theme. But if you have a farming game or a game about being in the wilderness and foraging the lands, wood might be the best choice. Just think about your user experience and what you want to see happening there. Okay, let's talk about some more pieces, right? Randomizers. You can use the classic dice to randomize things. I love dice. I love challenging all of the hot takes about dice. But dice can be expensive if you have too many. A great substitute for this is cards. And cards can also get expensive at very, very high quantities. But think about what works best for your game. If you have a game that uses more than 200 cards or more than about 20 dice or so, think about other ways to give the same purpose and satisfy that gameplay need, but still dialing back those components. One thing that we like to remind clients of, let's say you come to us with a game that has 100 dice in it, and you say, no, I know what I'm doing, and it just has dice and a box and a rule sheet. Imagine that those dice all cost 10 cents each. That's $10 of your unit cost in just dice, right? Even if we dial it back to just 50 dice, that's still $5. So, and maybe I did my math right. If I did my math wrong, somebody in the comments fix that for me. But point being, you really have to think about components and what works best for the user experience, plus balancing the cost of manufacturing the game, and if that price makes sense for the user experience and intended experience you want for the game. Moving on to hidden information, right? Hanabi does a great job of giving you hidden information by just turning your cards backwards. There's no extra component. There's nothing other than the cards, and simply changing the way the game plays in order to create hidden information. Player screens also do a great job of this. Dials and Sight do this as well, where you determine what your attack power could be or will be on your dial, and you place it on the board. Sight could have just used you get 5 cards or 12 cards, and you put one of those cards down, but the dial is way more functional. It feels better. It's less fiddly, right? You don't have to shuffle through and see, oh my gosh, where did my one go? I dropped it on the floor. No, my dial is right here. And even Lords of Zidit, right? In that game, you place power into like a hidden box, and so you don't know how many victory points players are placing into that area of the board, and so there's some hidden information there. Talking about share components, dice can also work in multiple ways. Not to brag on myself, but I kind of stole the Catan dice use, where you determine how you know it's a player's turn by who has the dice, right? You roll the dice, everybody gets resources, or nope, nobody gets resources, and then you pass it to the next player. Frogs and Rain does the same thing, where you roll dice, move your frog, and then you pass the die to the next player, indicating that it's a person's turn. Think about that when you're thinking about your game. Oh, I have this first player marker, but is there something that's already in the game that I can use also as an indicator of whose turn it is? It'll help you save costs. It'll save space in your box, right? Talking about Bonanza, multi-use cards, Lost Winds of Arnak, right? Great games that do great things with using a single component to do multiple things. Pandemic also does this. How do you know you lose the game? Well, you've run out of resources. We're not giving you 90 to account for that one offhand edge case. We're going to give you 20, and when you run out, you know you lost. And then also using the same component in multiple ways. Carcassonne does this. Your meeples have 3 different functions. If you place them in a city, they're a knight. If you place them on a row, they're highwaymen. If you lay them down, changing the orientation, the look of the same component, they're now a farmer and they do something different. So you can look at the board and see the same component in 3 different ways. Another thing to keep in mind. Some other things to consider: just setup time, environmental considerations, expansions, exclusive editions, and multi-language print runs, right? For setup, just think about inserts versus bags, cardboard inserts, versus plastic, bags for players to keep their pieces in. You know, if there's a specific half dozen of pieces that players will always get, maybe they all go in their own little cloth bag, or even their own transparent PE bag. Thinking about the environment, you can use FSC components, you can use paper wrapping instead of shrink wrapping, using wood components instead of plastic. With expansions, this is really important for your box size. Do you want to build an initial box that fits tons of additional content that you know you'll be making in the future? What about color matching? These are all things to think about when you're designing your game and how that works with manufacturing. And then, are there exclusive editions? Do you have a deluxe versus the standard edition of the game? What does that mean for assembly? What does that mean for creating different box covers? How are they labeled for fulfillment? To make that easier, different SKUs, component upgrades, all of those things are important things to consider. And then multi-label print runs. That comes with plate changes. All right, is all of your text in 100% black? Because that'll be a much less expensive plate change than a 4-color plate change. You can have multiple rulebooks or one single rulebook with multiple languages in the same book. And then you can use iconography to make sure that some components don't need to be changed in your new language. They're completely language independent. All right, so let's talk about further refining your game. You can simplify custom components by having cardboard constructibles instead of a giant metal dice tower. It can be built out of cardboard, punch board. And honestly, that's probably one of my biggest things that I geek out about is just seeing what people can do with innovative ideas for constructibles. With miniatures, you can try to reduce the number of sculpts that you have. So if you have like a leader and then soldier units, maybe all 6 of your soldier units have the same sculpt, but then your opponent has a different sculpt for those 6 units instead of every single one of those being different. And then you can optimize your custom plastics for less pre-assembly, right? This goes back to that ownership, right? If there are some snap bases, you can just have those not already attached to the miniatures when they're packed into the box. Thinking about those kinds of things and how you want the game to sort of give an experience when the player opens that box are also important. Okay, so reducing quantities. This is also kind of touching back on pandemic and how you have a limited number of cubes in the game that represent the game ending, right? The image that you see at the top is actually from Mars Needs Mechanics. They have these nesting denomination tokens, and the single token, the smaller one, is like, I believe, either 1 or 3, but when you place it into the larger piece, it's worth more. And what's really cool about this is that's a piece of punch board, right? And it's utilized twice, which, I mean, it's brilliant. You can do double-sided boards, or like a game board. On one side, it could be for 2 players, and you turn the board over, and it's 3 to 4 players. Definitely take advantage of double-sided boards. Typically, it doesn't cost extra much at all to print on the backside of a board versus making it just that single, black or unfinished backing. And even if you don't have a board that changes for your player count, consider doing what Merchants of the Dark Road did, where the backside of their board is actually just like this beautiful art print of the name of the game with some halftone art. So yeah, you can have 2D components that have multiple states. What I mean by that is there can be an A side, a B side, and a non-existent side, right? Let's say your punch board token for health, on one side it's, healthy. You flip it over, it's wounded. And if that token goes away, if you no longer have that token on your player board, then your player is dead or, knocked out. So think about how components can have multiple states in the same piece. Trackers can really reduce component counts. Think about how terraforming Mars uses trackers. You can go from 100 down to 20 or even 10 cubes in the right scenarios, and it's much quicker, less fiddly to keep track of things that way instead of counting out, I have 10, 20, 17, I lost count. Now I got to go back and, count those again. One of my favorite things to do is use the back of a rulebook as a player aid, right? That'll save you a sheet, probably up to 6 sheets if your game plays 6 players. You don't really have to give every player a player aid. You can just print it on the back of the rulebook, and if somebody needs it, they can just pass it around, or make it a quick start guide. If you're kind of familiar with the game but you haven't played it in 4 months, you can just flip the rulebook over. I don't need to know all the rules. I just need to remember this one piece of setup that I can't think about. And then using the inside of your box as some piece of integral part of the game, right? Like I mentioned with printing on the backside of your game board, printing on the inside of your box is also a very cost-conscious way to make your game really nice. It can be a score track, it can be a dice tray, it can just have really cool art. Vamp on the Batwalk actually takes the inside of the game box and the backside of the game box and utilizes both of those to make a modeling stage. Like, just brilliant. And the Tiny Epic Galaxies also does this, always utilizing the inside of their box. Okay, so let's talk about final tweaks. I'm sure I don't have to tell anybody here this. Probably more so myself, honestly. I mean, just thinking about all the people I'm seeing in the comments, I look up to a lot of these people, and we all know that you're going to iterate 1,000 times on your game, right? You need to test it with how many components are needed at each player count. You know, what are people scoring? What's the highest score that you've seen? What does that mean for my denominations that I'm doing for my punch board? You need to think about how you organize your punch boards to reduce your die cut patterns, right? This is something that we talk about in our graphic design guidebook, and any pre-press specialist like myself can help you with as well. You can also make sure to have your rules reviewed over and over and over, because your co-designer, your mom, someone's going to miss the typo. So having more and more people review your rules is only helpful. And there are actually Facebook groups that do monthly rules reviews. So get those rules reviewed, and let's not have to, fix those typos at the end of the mass production phase when you notice them during your mass production copy. Yeah, so moving on. This mouse is really sensitive. So let's talk about some printing basics, right? The standard boards can fold a number of ways, but the standard sizes, and I say standard, you can do a half fold, you can do a 1/4 fold, or you can do a 1/6 fold. Again, we can do a couple extra interesting things, including puzzle boards that don't actually fold. They come together like puzzle pieces, but those are the standard ones. Additional die cut patterns, as I mentioned before, they cost more. So if you have, 8 triangular tokens and 4 circles, you don't want to put all of your circles on one die or one punch board and then all of your triangles on a different punch board. That'll be 2 die molds. But if you put 4 triangles on one and 2 circles on that same piece, you can use the same die mold to punch both of those boards and get all of the pieces that you need. And as I mentioned before, double-sided printing costs almost nothing extra. There's also some standard card sizes shown there. I won't go through all of those. All right, let's talk about the power of $1. Going back to our board game math economics 101 situation. If you were to make an improvement on your game and take $1 off of your unit costs, that in the end can save $5 on your MSRP, or you can actually put that dollar, and again, this is per unit, not per print run. So if you're printing 2,000 units, that's actually $2,000. But you can invest those things into your art, your royalties, manufacturing, and all those extra things. And before I move away from this slide, I'll briefly touch on shipping, which is a bit of a volatile beast that we try to maintain. But let's imagine you were making a game with a print run of 2,000 at $7, like I said before. That $3 shipping per unit to bring your landing cost to 10 might come from an estimated shipping cost, freight shipping, of $6,000 divided by those 2,000 units, which is 3. So you add that $3 to your $7 unit cost to give you a landing cost of $10. So in summary, focus on the gameplay and the experience. Be efficient. Pay attention to your materials and quantities and how they're used. And then remember that the components should complement the gameplay, and the gameplay should inform the experience. But before we wrap up, I'll give you a bit of homework, courtesy of my good man, the God of Thunder. Look at your current design and just ask yourself a couple questions. Is this needed? Do I need this many of them? Is this the right component for the job at hand? And then what else could I use this component for? So let's kind of hop into some questions. I saw my teammates kind of crushing it. But if we have any questions that have not been answered yet, I'd be happy to talk about those. I think we got about 13, 10, maybe minutes left. Why am I so awesome? I'm not gonna try to be clever about it. I just do my best, man. I'm gonna take David Masnato's line and just say I'm just doing my best. Okay, Economat. Pretty sure I said that right. They have a question. If there's a fun gimmick like a cardboard prop, like a Burger King crown, those more expensive than they're worth or actually cheap? So the example you gave, Economat, that's, I think, a feasible way to add some table presence and some eye-catching element to your game, because that is a piece of paper, right? That's just folded in a very intricate way. That's, it's not made of metal or something like that. It won't increase the weight of your game. It won't add a bunch to the cost. Okay. How am I so awesome, Ashwin? I don't drink coffee. Sure, that's the answer. I don't know. Any highlights of the superficial manufactured game? Something we can aspire to look for in ideas. That is an interesting question, Ryan X. Some of the things that super efficient games do. I'm going to leave that to the team to think about for a bit. I don't have anything off the top of my head, but thank you, because that's a really good question. Okay, I'm going to answer Ian's question and then go down to Clark's. Ian asks, as a publisher, what level of testing do you expect designers to bring before you'll consider publishing their game? And I assume you mean manufacturing their game. So we have an estimator on our website that you can use to input your components, whether those are rough, and you just kind of want a standard idea of what a game might cost. Or if you want to take it a little further and refine those components, you can get an idea of what it'll cost to get that game manufactured. And we kind of look at that in the same way. If you know what your specs are and your game isn't really changing, if you play tested it and you've decided, okay, I just need to lay down some really, really solid art, I think that's a good time for you to come to us and say, hey, I want to get this quoted. And you can just use the number that we provide you in the quote to set your goal for your crowdfunding campaign. Or if you're not crowdfunding, you're fortunate enough to just have the funds to, produce your game, or if you've already crowdfunded, then I would say just make sure your components are not too undetermined. If you have a really good idea about what's already in the game. Okay. Gene, I'm going to come back to your question, but Clark asks if I can talk about putting effort and money into a feature component a la Jamie Stegmaier's philosophy. Oh, yeah. So, gosh, my designer mind feels like there's no one way to do it, but there's definitely a great philosophy of your game could have one element that's really, really striking about it. And even if that element of the game does cost a lot, um, working around that and designing a game that doesn't have all the components cost a lot and everything else is sort of complementing and supplementing that piece of the game, you can really design around that way. I guess it's hard for me to really speak on it except by giving an example. I'm working on a game that is going to have a biscuit display tower, and the rest of the game is going to be extremely cheap because I know that part, or it's not going to be cheap. It's not going to be crazy components. That part is going to be the one element of the game where the experience is focused. So I know that part is going to be a lot of the bulk of the unit cost. So going back to Gene's question, which components scale really well and which do not? I assume you mean like which components can you start to get a lot of and not heavily increase the price? If that's what you mean, Gene, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. I would say cards. Cards are, a go-to in our industry. And wood pieces, if you're careful about it, wood pieces can scale kind of nice without getting too crazy. But I think that definitely comes with a caveat of a case-by-case basis. Jonathan, I'm so glad that you enjoyed the presentation. What is the highest margin game type? Card game, large Kickstarter game. I don't know that I can confidently answer at the highest margin game type. That's tough because kind of how I was speaking earlier, I don't know this for sure, but I feel like Exploding Kittens has a very good margin, right? Because that game is all cards and sometimes a fancy box depending on which version you get. But for the experience you're getting, people will pay quite a lot, a lot being like 25, maybe even $30 for a game that probably doesn't cost, 5 or 6 or 7 or 8. So to get a game that has a high margin, I think the core of that is building an experience around components that are really affordable and the experience sort of is greater than that those components cost, if that makes sense. I hope it makes sense for you. And if not, you can just email us at hello@pandagm.com, and one of our project managers will be able to talk with you some more. Josh asked if I can talk about common Kickstarter bonus rewards. It's hard to add them into the original. Josh, I'm very thankful that you asked for that. I'm going to answer this one and maybe we'll do one more and then I'll bring that back up. But for Kickstarter stretch goals, there are a lot of ways that you can go about this. My personal favorite way and my way that I recommend whenever I'm meeting a client and doing my account management, I tell them that having Kickstarter stretch goals that don't add new things and just sort of upgrade pieces is a really great way to go about it. So adding spot UV to your box or linen finish to any of your print components, your box, your cards, your rules, your punch board, thickening your punch board from 2 millimeter to 2.5 or 3 millimeter, adding maybe another 10 or 9 or 8 team cards to your game. What are some other good stretch goals? Uh, Typically around finishes is like the number one thing that I recommend. Um, for wood pieces, let's say you have meeples that don't have any printing on them, you could add a silk screen or a heat transfer that isn't as affordable as adding a finish to print components, but it's a way to increase that player experience without adding new pieces or changing out those wood pieces for metal ones or miniatures or anything like that. Yeah, so I'm going to bring that back up and we're going to go to our last slide, because if you all have any more questions for us, we're actually going to be hosting another session. I think we just set the date to early November, and it's going to be a complete Ask Me Anything office hours. I'll probably bring another panda up so that it's a little more conversational, but we are going to continue to just provide as much assistance as we can to this community, because we love to educate and just be a part of the community. And like I said, we love designing games as much as we love playing and making them. So yeah, that's the presentation.